I would say the chances of a Francis II, they're not zero, and they're not insignificant, but I'd put them at 1 in 5 at the most.
Hello and welcome to Spectator TV. Today we are going to be talking about the death of the Pope, Pope Francis, who died Easter Monday, yesterday. And we will also be looking at the future of Catholicism and talking a bit about what the next papacy might look like. To have this conversation, I'm delighted to be joined by Ed Condon, who is founder and editor of The Pillar, which is a very essential reading website for Catholics and non-Catholics who are interested in the Catholic Church. Ed, thank you very much for coming on to Spectator TV. You wrote an excellent sort of quick-fire response to the death of the Pope, which was published on Spectator yesterday, in which you pointed out his virtues, and I think you are less critical than a lot of Catholics have been about Pope Francis, but you did said he leaves the Church divided. Can you explain a bit the ways in which he's left his Church divided, and the ways in which perhaps it might be more divided now than it was at the start of his papacy?
Sure, I think it's unquestionably true, I think, in any fair-minded assessment to say that the Church is more divided now than it was the day that Francis became Pope. Don't be wrong, the Church had plenty of problems at the time of Francis's election, but one of the sort of great animating spirits of the Francis pontificate, I think, has been the reviving of debates and discussions that were thought over in the decades following the Second Vatican Council. The sort of revivifying of old grudges, old debates, old in many cases, sort of theological civil war between wings of the Catholic Church that under the long pontificates of JP2 and then the slightly more abbreviated one of Benedict XVI were seen to sort of have been put to bed. And, the future of the Church and the interpretation of the Council, which was this great sort of defining moment in the Church's history in the 20th century, appeared settled. And all of a sudden, everything seemed to be open again and up for grabs and up for debate. But while Francis was very good at re-raising all of these issues and sort of giving them oxygen and fanning them back into life, he didn't really give much of a firm steer on how he wanted those conversations to be resolved. You can relitigate all of those conversations if you want to definitively answer them, or you can relitigate them with a view to seeing what happens. And Francis seemed to be more and more a pope who wanted to see what happens. And I think, really looking at the sort of the final 5 years of his pontificate, it became clear Francis not only didn't have a clear vision for how he wanted it to end, I don't think he saw himself as the man to end it either. That he was very much creating a sort of new division, a new crisis time in the Church that he expected his successor to answer. Now, you can have your own view on whether that was a reckless way for the Pope to govern the Church, or perhaps a prescient one to say that, these debates never really went away. They were just buttoned up under hatches. And the next conclave, the one that we'll meet shortly, needs to have this conversation in full and needs to have it in a sort of no holds barred way. And there needs to be a final resolution to how the Church sees itself in the 21st century.
And the issues that he sort of brought back into church debate are mostly matters relating to sexual morality or marriage. And as you say, he didn't actually change the church on these issues. Some might say he can't actually change the church on these issues. But he did seem to. I mean, in 2023, I think the church seemed to be moving towards accepting same-sex unions or giving blessings to same-sex unions, but then that was rowed back quite quickly. Similar issues on divorced and remarried Catholics, whether they can accept communion. There seemed to be some reform going on there, and then that didn't happen. And so he really was not a substantial pope in that sense, for better or worse.
Well, it depends on what your metric is for success and substantial. With regards to marriage stuff, one of the first sort of big shaking up documents that he issued was something called Mitis Iudex Dominus Iesus, which was a primarily legal text looking at how the Church examines cases of marriage nullity. The Church doesn't recognize divorce as a reality. It believes marriage to be permanent and indissoluble. But the Church does recognize that some attempts to contract marriage were done in a flawed way, and that a union can never have existed. I mean, anyone who knows the history of Henry VIII knows the difference between a church annulment and a civil divorce. And I think some of Francis's reforms on that were considered pretty radical at the time, but ultimately have shaken out rather well. I don't think much was changed there in terms of teaching or doctrine, but the practical mechanics of how those things got done, I think a lot of people, myself included, were very alarmed by what he was attempting. But generally speaking, we've seen that it's worked all right. On things like human sexuality, I think you're exactly right, that there's a lot of sort of sound and fury, and then what appears to be a lot of rowing back. The announcement made in December of 23 suggested and was certainly interpreted by a lot of people as saying the church had opened the door to the blessing of same-sex unions. And then very quickly, the department that issued that letter said, no, we're not talking about blessing the unions, we're talking about blessing the people, and there's an essential difference because, of course, gay people have equal human dignity to everyone else, and they should never be denied a blessing because the blessings are there for all people and all sorts of situations. So again, nothing changed in sort of the teaching of the church. A lot of people felt that this was a fudge and that, it did nothing but disappoint both sides. Other people thought it was part of what Francis was very good at, which was not changing the teaching of the church, but changing the sort of music to which it was scored and saying, well, this is evidence that the church can be, fully recognizing of universal human dignity, for example, and creating a pastoral space for the care of gay Catholics. And they were happy with that. Unfortunately, he never went far enough for one side to be satisfied, and going any distance at all was too much for another. And so I think all of these things ended up causing more controversy than they ever resolved.
But he was a more popular figure, I think it's fair to say, with the secular world. Certainly the left of centre, left liberal press were much more enthused about him because he seemed to be more open to their worldview than his predecessors.
Yes, I think he had a knack for speaking in an intuitively emotional way, and certainly a comfort with being spontaneous that certainly Benedict XVI never had. He was very much an academic, a scholar. You couldn't imagine Benedict being comfortable giving an in-flight press conference, which sort of became one of Francis's hallmark ways of communicating with the world. And Francis was a firm adopter of things and causes that are very popular in the wider secular and liberal press. The cause of environmentalism, things like that. I think, in a sense, he both created and benefited from a false impression of himself amongst the secular media, that he was seen to be less Catholic somehow than John Paul II or Benedict XVI when it came down to certain issues that people outside of the church want to see or demand to see, like the ordination of women, things like that. He was right in step with his predecessors. He just appeared more fluent in front of them. But then again, they had a way of overlooking the things that Francis would say that they disagreed with. So you see a lot of coverage of Pope Francis, having a sort of "who am I to judge" approach, the great soundbite, even though it was a very narrowly given one. But you saw rather less coverage of the Pope calling the practice of abortion a eugenics practice and assassination with white gloves. That's not a quote that circulated very much in the New York Times or the Guardian or things like that. So I think there was a sort of self-selecting impression of Pope Francis, that people took him in the way they wanted to, and very few people made an effort to see him in the whole.
And he was very interested in what he calls the throwaway culture, which abortion comes into. It's a sort of vision of a very Christian understanding, I think, of the world as far too material, far too selfish, not sufficiently interested in the eternal questions.
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. Although there again, I think we have Francis at his best in that he wasn't necessarily saying or thinking or doing something out of step with or radically departing from his immediate predecessors. He was just a much more effective communicator of it. Benedict XVI has the sort of reputation and the image in the popular imagination of being a rather stern and obtuse academic who didn't really engage with things, and if anything was fiercely conservative, and people import all their own definitions of what conservative means. But I think if they ever read anything Benedict XVI wrote on economics, for example, or the politics of redistribution, they'd be appalled, and they'd think he was, some sort of, they'd think him somewhere to the left of Tony Blair. And I think this is true of a lot of popes, is that people make their judgments of who they are and what they believe more or less on how they perceive their character, rather than the actual content of what they say. And Francis was really, really good and very, very effective at inhabiting the character of Pope Francis that the media created for him.
You mentioned the Second Vatican Council earlier, and those two papacies, the very long one of John Paul II and the shorter one of Benedict the 16th. And they, as you say in your piece, and as you said earlier, they were very much not exactly in reaction to the Second Vatican Council, but an attempt to stabilize the church after the Second Vatican Council and sort of put a brake on some of the more progressive forces that it perhaps unleashed. Do you think Pope Francis did the opposite?
I think so. How the Church has lived the Second Vatican Council and the half century following it has been a point of great contention. The Church, broadly speaking, I think falls into two camps: those who think the Council is defined by the documents that it produced and the things that it actually said, and those who sort of think the Second Vatican Council was more of a sort of happening man. It was, moods and vibes and a spirit, and whatever was written down isn't really the point. Pope Francis was very keen to sort of re-enfranchise the moods and vibes camp. And you saw this in things like the synodal process that he wanted to have be his sort of great legacy. He was very keen to put people who had that sort of strain of thought or adhered to that sort of ecclesiology in charge of it, and to have a sort of dynamic approach to being church, as the phrase always has it. And I think at the same time, though, Francis actually showed himself to be quite an anti-Vatican II pope in some respects, in that one of the great reforms of the Second Vatican Council, great I mean in terms of scope rather than assigning moral value to it, is Vatican II versus Vatican I try to row back very hard on the sort of the sense of the imperial papacy, and that local diocesan bishops are sort of franchisees or branch managers of the Vatican, and rediscover the sort of the full dignity and spiritual import of the office of the diocesan bishop. Pope Francis was, whether people liked him or loathed him for it, an obsessive micromanager in many cases, and was very comfortable deposing bishops without any kind of due process or even reasons given in some occasions, which was something that you simply wouldn't have thought possible under JP2 or Benedict. That they were much more tolerant of alternative strains of thought and alternative voices of criticism than Francis showed himself to be. So he showed himself to be quite a sort of anti-Vatican II, or very Vatican I pope in that sense.
Mm. And with this elusive word synodality, and he, I believe, had a synod on synodality, what I think a lot of priests, from my understanding, felt slightly disempowered by it, because he was reaching out to the laity more. It was about a communication between the very top of the church and the very bottom. And a lot of people in the middle felt slightly disgruntled at the process. Is that a fair assessment?
I think it's a fair assessment of part of it. I think a lot of laity felt very disenfranchised by it, because in the same way that it felt for many people like the Vatican trying to talk to the people in the pews, many of the people who were actually in the pews on a Sunday felt they were missed out entirely by the process, because there was this great emphasis on, as Francis liked to say, going to the peripheries, the people who don't come to church, the people who have fallen out of the practice of the faith, the people who are very distant from the church in sort of mind and in heart and in body. And I think a lot of Catholics who, do practice the faith, take the faith very seriously, felt that, what they thought about the state of the church was pretty widely ignored by the synodal process in favor of people who really had nothing to say other than what the church needs to change in order for them to come back. Mm. And I think it's one of but this is the problem of the synodal process, was it was intended to involve everyone, but it was definitely a weighted exercise in that sense.
And to a lot of our Anglican viewers, synods might sound quite Anglican.
Yes, and for a lot of Catholics, they sounded very Anglican too.
Yeah, and for a lot of conservative Catholics, I think the fear was that the Catholic Church was going down the route of the Anglican Communion, which is now very divided and split geographically, particularly on matters relating to sex, between a liberal European Western faction and a global South, if you like, church that sees things in a very different way.
Yes, and I think this was a view that was shared by a lot of Catholics, conservative and liberal, during the synodal process. You had, at the sort of top level, Pope Francis saying over and over again, the synod is not a parliament, it's not a sort of Anglican-style synodal body that, has governing force for the church. This is a consultative body that I'm convening under my authority, and I'll have the last word. But then you had experts on the synod put up by the Vatican to give press conferences and things, who would cite the Anglican Church and its governing structures as saying, this is what we like the look of. And I think a lot of people in the Catholic Church have looked at the sort of Anglican example of, as you say, a rupturing of, the sort of global church in the global South from a sort of more liberal European model, and said, if we're not careful, the Catholic Church could end up in the same boat. But then you've had other people looking at it saying, well, actually, that looks quite appealing. The Catholic Church in Germany has been pretty upfront saying, we don't think we have very much in common theologically or ecclesiologically with the church in Africa, and we don't accept Roman authority to sort of keep us all bound together to one common creed and have one unified supreme teaching authority. We quite like to row that back. We want to see a federal model. So you have had sort of people who look at the Anglican example of synodality in an alarmed sense, but others look at it quite wistfully.
Mm. And I suppose looking to the future of Catholicism, this is probably its gravest challenge in terms of unity, because it is this hierarchical, non-democratic structure existing in a modern, often very liberal world. And since the Second Vatican Council, the tensions have always been between the Church as an ancient structure and the Church as a modern entity. And can it survive these pressures of the modern liberal world?
Yeah, it's an open question, I would say, to what extent the Catholic Church, and particularly the structure of the Vatican, the Holy See, will continue in its present form, both sort of within the Church and how it operates and exercises power, but also as a creature of international law, as a sort of international, as a observer at the United Nations and things like that. These are very much open questions at this point, and I think this is exactly the sort of big picture conversation that the most charitable interpreters of the Francis pontificate would say he was very self-consciously setting up for this conclave, that he felt that this conversation needed to be had, it needed to be resolved definitively one way or another, and he saw it as his job to sort of tee up that debate. And whether he intended to or not, whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, it does seem to be what he's done.
And on other crises for the Catholic Church, notably the lingering sexual abuse scandals within the Church and corruption within the Vatican, Francis inherited from Pope Benedict, who you correct me if I'm wrong, it's thought one of the reasons for his resignation was that he felt overwhelmed by the corruption, the scandals within the Church, and he felt he wasn't dealing with it very well. Do you think Pope Francis has made progress on that?
Well, we've certainly come a long way. Whether that constitutes progress or not, I think, is an open question. Yes, we tend to forget, because Francis became such a sort of cultural icon in his own right, that when he was elected, when he sort of came out onto the balcony at the Vatican, everyone understood that the reason that a non-Italian, non-European pope with no Roman experience had been elected was they needed a new broom to come in and sweep out the Vatican. That, you're exactly right. Benedict XVI is widely understood to have resigned in large part because he considered himself unequal to the urgent task of dealing with Vatican corruption. And Francis, to his credit, never shied away from big reforms, never shied away from making bold, dramatic decisions and passing legislation when necessary. But his Achilles heel seemed to be he was also a deeply personally loyal person. And so he always seemed to have this tendency, I want to say, to turn on his own reformers if he felt they went too far or they impinged on the work of someone that he considered to be a close and trusted collaborator. And you saw this both in financial scandal matters, that Francis originally empowered and created all these new departments led by the Australian Cardinal Pell, and then sort of cooled on them and eventually turned on them when they started saying, no, we have to apply these financial reform measures even to the people you like, not just the people you're suspicious of. And the same, I think, is true in the Church's dealing with the lingering sexual abuse crisis, which was a big issue in the early years of his pontificate, certainly leading up 2018, was a sort of annus horribilis for him in that sense. And again, he called a global summit of all the world's bishops, passed landmark legislation. At the sort of theoretical legal level, it looked like great historical strides were being made. But then you saw that all break down when it came down to, well, there's actually a bishop in Argentina who's an old friend of Pope Francis who's accused of these things. Well, suddenly all the new rules went out the window, and certainly all the promises of transparency disappeared.
Mm. And I mean, I'm not going to ask you to speculate on who will be the next pope, because I think that's a very difficult guessing game. But I mean, it is, I think, probably fair to say that someone of a similar outlook to Francis, perhaps also outside of Europe, is quite likely to succeed, given the makeup of the College of Cardinals and the fact that he has appointed so many of these cardinals himself.
I don't know that I agree with that. I would say the chances of a Francis II, they're not zero, and they're not insignificant, but I'd put them at 1 in 5 at the most. It's true that Francis has appointed the vast majority of the cardinals who will elect his successor, but then again, you know, it was a conclave composed entirely of John Paul II and Benedict appointed cardinals who produced Francis. So that's not necessarily a guide to anything. One thing that we can say is that Francis has appointed an incredibly diverse college of cardinals to elect his successor, and they don't know each other terribly well. And I don't think it's even necessarily fair to say that Francis knew them all terribly well himself. That he had a great desire to see the College of Cardinals reflect the geographic and demographic diversity of the church in different parts of the world, and it does do that. But I think, you know, the idea that, for example, the half dozen some cardinals that Pope Francis named from Africa will all reflect a sort of Francis II world vision for the church, I think is pretty fanciful.
Mm.
I think we're in for a very interesting and very open conclave. I think you're right that, you know, only a fool makes too strong of predictions, but I think we have a pretty clear understanding of this conclave will go one of two ways. It will be short and it will produce a sort of steady hand at the tiller. You know, we've had more than a decade of a quite mercurial, up in the air papacy. We're ready for something a little more settled, a little more traditional, a little more solid. Or if it goes, you know, beyond the first sort of 72 hours, first 3 days, you could see the Cardinals start having these conversations, getting to know each other, and then we really could be in for another surprise pick along the lines of Karol Wojtyła, of whom almost no one had heard before he became John Paul II.
Hmm. And whoever the next pope is, a big issue that they'll have to deal with is something you've written quite a lot about, which is the Vatican's relationship with Beijing.
Yes.
China obviously being the emerging superpower in the world at the moment. And under Pope Francis, this diplomatic agreement was brokered, which seemed to allow, or did allow, I think I can say, does allow China to vet, essentially, church appointments. And that was quite a concession, and it angered a lot of Catholics, and it seemed to be against the sort of spirit of Catholicism to allow a foreign government to essentially do the Vatican's work for it. Do you think that will be something that the next pope will be under great pressure to reverse, or is it a done deal?
I think it's a done deal for the balance of the agreement, which I think it has another 2.5 years to run. It keeps being renewed periodically. And, you know, it created a lot of ill feeling when it was agreed first in 2018. And it does, at least the theory of it is it allows the Chinese government to approve candidates from whom the Pope will then, quote unquote, in freedom, appoint bishops. But the reality has been, and this has been borne out time and time again, it's the Chinese government who appoints Catholic bishops on the mainland. That, you know, they are picked by the Chinese government, they are announced by the Chinese government. In some cases, they are installed by the Chinese government, and the Vatican is left to, you know, do what it likes with that reality after the fact. And most of the time, the Vatican has chosen to just sort of accept it as a fait accompli, although there have been some cases which are still unresolved because it's simply not ecclesiologically possible for the church to cede what the Chinese government have done. I think there needs to be a revisiting of that, but the problem is they are caught in a bit of a trap. The church didn't sort of wantonly deal away the sole discretion in the appointment of bishops for nothing. They wanted some sort of mechanism to bring the underground Catholic Church in China above ground, to give it some sort of secure legal footing so that the vast majority of Catholics in the country weren't at risk of arrest and imprisonment at any moment. Now, that hasn't actually materialized in quite the way I think the Vatican would have liked. The civil liberties of Catholics there have not been protected in the measure to which there was an expectation when all of this was first agreed. But the problem is they're in the deal now. So and this is something I encounter talking to people who work in the Vatican Secretariat of State all the time, is they say, all right, fine, we pull out, but the deal we're in might not be making things measurably better, but pulling out could definitely make things measurably worse for the Catholics there. And that's the bind they're in now, is, they have opted to sup with the devil, and the spoon didn't turn out to be quite as long as they thought it was.
Well, an Asian pope may be quite important in that sphere, and there are thought to be strong contenders the next pope might be Asian.
Yes, there are one or two cardinals from Asia that certainly I think will be featuring in conversations in the general consistories that. The general congregations that precede the conclave, which I think is due to start a week Monday. There's Cardinal Cito Tagle, who everyone has a fairly high media profile. He's quite well known around Rome. He's one of the sort of, I guess you could say, 3 or 4 cardinals who enjoy a certain amount of name recognition, even if people don't necessarily have a firm grasp on who they are underneath it all. He's certainly a possibility, and he is, pretty warm on the China deal. He's pretty happy with it. That it's widely understood that he got his job as head of the Church's Department for the Evangelization in the Vatican, what used to be called Propaganda Fide back in the old days. That he got his job because his predecessor was moved out because he was insufficiently keen on the China deal. So Cardinal Tagle does come with that sort of baggage or endorsement of being open to warm relations with China, and sort of see that as steps that can be taken in a good direction. But equally, you have Cardinal Bo from Myanmar, who has been a fierce and vocal critic of China and the Chinese Communist Party, and denounced in previous years the Vatican's China deal as a sort of betrayal of Catholics there, and indeed of the Church in the Asian continent. So, you have polar opposites sort of there, both in the same conversation. So it'll be interesting to see who chooses to raise the issue as the cardinals are meeting and discussing, who wants to frame that conversation around the next pope.
Well, I promised I wasn't going to try and get into runners and riders, but given that we've just been talking about Asia, and of course China against America as the two competing superpowers in the world is one of the big political stories of our time, the geostrategic stories of our time. I've heard some people talking today about the possibility of an American pope. Do you think that is a likely outcome?
No. I would predict a pope from almost any other continent before I would predict one from the United States. I think there's one Canadian in the mix, Cardinal Collins. He'd be a great pope. I'd be happy with that, but I think it's unlikely. I would be shocked for a North American to step out onto the loggia when it's all over. I think there have in the past, and even the recent past, been Americans who might have been an interesting candidate for the job, but they have by and large aged out. I think Cardinal Sean O'Malley, formerly of Boston, was probably the last one who had a sufficiently global profile amongst his brother cardinals that may have been considered as a candidate. But as I say, he's over 80 now, so he won't even be in the conclave.
Well, Ed, we'll leave it there. But thank you very much for coming on to Spectator TV, and I hope we'll get you on again as the conclave progresses.
My thanks for having me.